Hello, very beautiful community. The Institute for the Study of War is a Washington-based think tank that tracks conflicts through open sources, and you probably came across its maps, even if you've not heard of it before. Now, it's made a bold headline, and we're going to break it down. Russia appears to be accelerating the informational and psychological condition setting phase 0, of its campaign to prepare for a possible NATO-Russia war in future. Okay, sounds alarming. Now, we're going to break it down at the level of whether we believe it historically, but also at the level of how we ourselves relate epistemically to claims made in our informational environment. So let's tuck ourselves in. We're going to do a little bit of a talk about epistemic virtues and a little bit of a talk about Russo-NATO conflict. Now, look at these people from ISW on the right. They are young. And one of the things that's really important in our world, and I always check myself about it, and I don't always get it right, is that there's so much negativity that we're exposed to, that there's a risk that the balance between negativity and positive things hitting you is just off. And that means that any minor public intellectual worth their salt has to understand that there's a natural limit to how negative you can be, no matter how much the negativity is justified. You can't take 10 items, make 9 out of the 10 negative and put them into people's tummies and then put one positive one in. That doesn't work like that. It's just not human. And so I'm cautious that sometimes when it's correct to say something negative, that I don't, because it cannot quite be separated from the context of 10 other negative things I might say. And so it's a very important balance for people who are public voices in our culture to keep in mind. You can't just say, Susan is a moron, Ricky is an idiot, and Davy is a fool. It might be that each of the 3 claims is true, but if that's all you're doing, you're actually, in the end, arguably somewhat poisoning the information environment, even though nothing you're saying is untrue. Capiche? So what am I driving at here? It's that these people look young, and I don't want to sit on my butt here in my bed-bound state and say, well, Vlad, what did you do today? Well, I went on the internet and I memed on some young researchers and I told them off for being useless. Well, I don't want to do that. But we're not going to fluff our lines at the same time, but we're going to be respectful. Right. So let's kick this off. So apparently there is a condition setting phase 0, of Russia's campaign to prepare for a possible NATO-Russia war in the future. I don't know anything about it. None of these researchers know anything that I don't. So what is going on? Let's read. Russia appears to be conducting concerted preparations as part of physical and psychological condition setting. And we're going to try to tease a little bit, but we're going to try to not tease too much. I'm also condition setting for the sip of tea I'm going to take. I have set the conditions for the sip of tea. And so I moved from stage 0 to stage 1, which is the tea sipping stage. And then stage 7 is when you've completed the tea drinking. So the Russians are doing psychological condition setting for war contingencies. Russia has been engaged in a variety of overt and covert attacks against NATO states, such as sabotage operations, interference, GPS jamming, arson, blah, blah, blah. Russia has dramatically increased these attacks on NATO states in recent weeks since fall 2025, most notably with the drone incursions into NATO airspace. And there are later some qualifications about that not all of these drones might be Russian and so on. The pattern of organized activity suggests that Russia has entered the first phase of preparations, phase 0, to move to a high-level war, to a higher level of war than the one Russia is currently engaged in, such as a future Russia-NATO war. ISW is not assessing at this time whether the Kremlin has decided to engage in such a high level of war, or on what in such a high level of war, or on what timeline the Kremlin may be expected to do so. Russia has been undertaking longer-term plans that ISW assesses may be part of. I know what's happening. Partly. The other stuff is brain inflammation, but I'm actually not seeing it properly. Now I'm going to read better. Russia has been undertaking longer-term plans that ISW assesses may be part of a preparation for a NATO-Russia war in the future, such as the restructuring of Russia's military districts on its western border and the buildup of military bases on the border with Finland. ISW has not observed indicators that Russia is actively preparing for an imminent conflict with NATO at this time. So let's do this again. This pattern of organized activity suggests that Russia has entered the first phase of preparations, phase 0, to move to a higher level of war than the one it's been previously engaged in, such as a future NATO-Russia war. ISW is not assessing at this time whether the Kremlin has decided to engage in such a high level of war or on what timeline the Kremlin may expect to do so. Russia has been undertaking longer-term plans that ISW assesses may be part of preparation for a future NATO-Russia war. And then at the end here, ISW has not observed indicators that Russia is actively preparing for an imminent conflict. So let's look at this again. The first phase of preparations, phase 0. That sounds like a doctrinal term, right? The first phase of preparations, phase 0. That sort of describes pre-conflict shaping operations of some kind. Do the Russians have that term? Do they use it? I'm going to postulate no. And if they did use it, would ISW have any idea that that's what they're doing? Well, only if the rest of the world did. So if the rest of the world didn't, then if that's what the Russians were doing, ISW couldn't know it because they don't have any special access to what the Russians are doing. So we can replace the first set of preparations, phase 0, essentially with woo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo, right? There's no less epistemic credibility to literally saying woohoo instead of saying that, right? That's complete baloney, irrespective of the real prospects of a Russia-NATO war. Let's go on. Take a richer perspective on this sentence. The pattern of organized activity suggests that Russia has entered the first phase of preparations, phase 0, to move to a higher level of war. Sorry for the misspell there. So hybrid activity there is reframed as a step toward a higher level of war. And there is nothing unreasonable about making that case, in principle. But the problem here is about epistemic categories. The phrase phase, the line phase O gives the impression that this reframing of hybrid activity as a move to a higher stage of war is actually based on verifiable evidence as opposed to interpretation. And it's not based on any verifiable evidence. So there is a little bit of aspirational language here, right? That is not actually substantiated by the content of what we're reading. And the language is aspirational toward intelligence community speak and toward empirical and verifiable claims, whereas in effect, what we're given here is in no way different to a responsible or irresponsible, you judge, speculation, right? That Mark Galeotti might present on the radio appropriately. But Mark will not dress up his language in intelligence community speak. ISW is not assessing at this time whether blah, blah, blah. And this phrase imitates the cautious probabilistic style of an intelligence community briefing, right? We say with low confidence that X might happen. So it signals epistemic humility and empirical accuracy when what's being given is just an interpretive speculation. Nothing wrong with it, but what's wrong is the epistemic clothes in which it's dressed up. This may be part of preparation for a NATO-Russia war in the future. And here maybe protects against falsification, while letting the headline suggestion, woo-hoo-hoo, Russia-NATO war, travel unchallenged. So it's a sort of a hedge that props up an earlier saggy assertion. ISW has not observed indicators that Russia is actively preparing for an imminent conflict. ISW does not observe indicators. Right? So, but what's interesting here is that this is a kind of a disclaimer that somewhat undercuts the earlier alarmism, but it comes too late, right? Because the original framing has already been set in place. Readers, be alert about the prospects of a Russian-NATO war. So it's a kind of a weird sandwich, right? There's a big claim, there's evidence light that comes after it, and then there's a kind of a soft semi-retraction. So I think what we're seeing here is that we've got intelligence-sounding language without any actual intelligence access. We've got evidential language being used about claims that are unverifiable. They could be reasonable interpretive claims, but once you dress them up in evidential language, you undermine yourself. And there's a kind of a dilution of the early boldness there with the hedges that come too late. And there's a shoddy treatment of epistemic categories, right? You move from observed facts to speculation about historical processes, to speculation about the psychological framing of the agents behind these processes. So I'm not going to do an analysis of the motives of ISW, right? Is it to generate headlines with a bold claim? Is it to feed into public debate in a particular way? I'll simply say that this communication from ISW is post-truth light, saying and not saying something at the same time, and it's disinformation light. There's not really any falsehood there, but it has the structure of disinformation, actually. What all of this actually rests on, because there's nothing interestingly empirical there, is just what theory of the regime you have, and theories, of course, in quote marks. And you need to distinguish here between three things. The regime's publicly stated aims, the regime's internal self-understanding of its own aims, and the regime's actual aims. And it's in that, actually, that an answer is going to be found about the questions of the real prospects of a Russo-NATO war. And what is that? That is an analysis. That is an interpretation, right? Interpretations are not subjective or relative. Some are better than others. But that's what we're dealing with. What we've had here is an interpretation, backed up by the kind of materials that it doesn't need, and then in fact that undermine it. So is this post-truth? A little, yes. Is this disinformation? A little, yes. It has the post-truth structure, it has the disinformation structure. And notice that we've got a little bit of awkwardness here, because there are really two camps when it comes to the prospect of Russo-NATO conflict. There's a quietist camp, which says it ain't gonna happen, it's just Ukraine. And there is an alarmist camp. And who is in the alarmist camp? Me. I might be in the moderate end of the alarmist camp, but I'm in an alarmist camp, right? Mark Galeotti would say that Russia's regime security depends on foreign escalation. I would consider going further and saying that it might depend on war. In fact, the reason I think that we are on balance likely to skip Russo-NATO conflict is because of the contingency of history, not because the Kremlin regime isn't set on that trajectory. But again, when we talk about that trajectory, we're of course not talking about full-scale conflict. We're talking about a low-threshold challenge by the Russians of Article 5 in a way that they hope will lead NATO not to respond. So the point of a conflict with NATO for Russia is that NATO doesn't fight back and doesn't even properly recognize that it's been attacked. And that is going to be toxic for the alliance's democracies in domestic politics. And that's the Russian aspiration, right? Ungovernability in Western democracies, leading them to produce, right, into power political figures who are ideologically and otherwise sympathetic to the Kremlin. So, you see, there is no connection whatever between what stance you take on the question of the odds of Russo-NATO conflict and the correct rejection of the epistemic awkwardness and, to a degree, cheeky manipulativeness of the ISW report, right? You can be the biggest alarmist about the Russo-NATO war, and you would still need to reject the rubbish that ISW has produced, unfortunately, on this occasion. So I hope this exercise has been useful. Lots of love and talk soon.